Dr. Nass. Thank you very much for attending today. Again, if you would provide an introduction for the record, it would be appreciated.
My name is Dr. Meryl Nass. I have been a doctor for 39 years. I am in the private practice of internal medicine in Ellsworth, Maine. I graduated from MIT and the University of Mississippi Medical School. I have never been sanctioned by any body. I don't know what the minister was referring to. I'm listed in Who's Who in America and Who's Who in the World. I've qualified as a medical expert for the courts in the U.S. and in Canada. And I have given 7 congressional testimonies, as well as testified to 3 states. But if I gave the talk I'm going to be giving today, I don't think any of that would have happened. It's very controversial, and I have given you electronically links that provide documentation of everything I'm saying today, even though it will surprise you. I've spent 20 years discussing the science of anthrax vaccine, smallpox vaccine, and then other vaccines. And after 20 years, I have seen that the decisions that are being made have very little to do with the science right now, and that my own profession and the practice of medicine has been so influenced by financial conflicts of interest that we are losing the ethical basis and the scientific ability to practice as we used to. So that's why I'm here. I also never take money, but my expenses are paid for this appearance, and I too am taking a couple of days off work. As a veteran of the vaccine war in the U.S., I feel compelled to talk about what I'm saying today. Legislators were forced to change their votes by their leadership in order to revoke vaccine exemptions and rescind the historic right to consent to medical procedures. The vaccine war is a dirty war in which platitudes about protecting the most vulnerable are invoked by the same companies that have paid $2.7 billion in criminal penalties in the United States during a recent 4-year period. The vaccine industry generates enormous profits, estimated at 10 to 40%, benefits from a government-guaranteed market, and receives almost total liability protection. This industry's rapacious desire to grow and guarantee its Canadian market is why we are here today. Let me note that in 2014, the New York Times said it cost $2,200 to fully vaccinate one child. At that price, it costs $163 billion to fully vaccinate every U.S. child. Vaccine mandates are valuable. May I apologize for using U.S. data. I provide Canadian New Brunswick information when available. You have my written testimony. Today, I've omitted half of that for brevity. You have the electronic links. On March 2019, since March 2019, representatives of 3 vaccine manufacturers, GSK, Merck, and Sanofi, came to Fredericton. Pharmaceutical companies are colluding to expand on legislative victories gained in the U.S. Using a media storm over measles, censorship of vaccine-related websites, new support from professional organizations that have benefited from industry largesse, and deals with political leaders, the right to religious and philosophic exemptions has been voted away by legislatures in California, New York, Maine, and elsewhere. The Speaker of the New York Assembly was caught on videotape directing a committee member to change his vote when a mandate bill had just been voted down. Vaccines are being developed for everything from acne to cancers. Vaccine mandates guarantee a vaccine market now and in the future. Mandates put in place today will enforce the uptake of vaccines on the required list, plus others yet to be determined. In the wake of the Disneyland measles epidemic, coupled with millions of dollars in lobbying fees and donations to legislators, California's legislators voted to end non-medical exemptions. And this month, they may limit even medical exemptions. One of the unforeseen consequences of this vote was the wholesale removal of children from public schools. California's Department of Public Health reported that the number of homeschooled, unvaccinated kindergartners soared from 2,000 to nearly 7,000 in a period of 2 years as a result of California's vaccine mandate. You've been assured that vaccines are safe and effective. The initial effectiveness of different childhood vaccines ranges from about 40% for flu shots to about 90 to 98% for measles vaccines. The others fall somewhere in between. For some of them, the protection lasts fairly well over time, but for all of them it falls off to a degree, and for the pertussis shot and the mumps shot, it falls off considerably in a very few years. And that is what has been blamed, if you read the recent literature, for both pertussis outbreaks and mumps outbreaks in the U.S. and Canada. In terms of safety assessment, there is a big problem, which is adverse event information is withheld from physicians and the public by our public health agencies in the U.S. Undesirable results are massaged until they look acceptable, and I've given you 3 examples. The papers published with this manipulated data provide foundational support for the claim of safety of the MMR vaccine and of mercury in vaccines. These papers pollute the medical literature, making it impossible to discern the true adverse event profiles of vaccines. In 2011, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine, this is a different study than Dr. Sears talked about, they examined the evidence for vaccine causality for 8 specific vaccines and 158 specific health outcomes. In the majority of cases, in the language that is used in these reports, and these are congressionally mandated reports, quote, the evidence was inadequate to accept or reject a causal relationship. In fact, the science has never been settled. And that's what the National Academy of Sciences tells you, despite the fact Merck has given them 5 to 10 million, and other vaccine manufacturers have given them between 1 and 5 million each. A Canadian study, for an example, looked at the MMR vaccine in children at 12 and 18 months and found that the 12-month shot caused 1 baby in every 168 to pay an extra ER visit, about 1 to 2 weeks after the shot. Narcolepsy, another vaccine, Pandemrix, used in 2009, caused narcolepsy in Europe. Canadians received a virtually identical vaccine called Arapanrix, and by sheer chance, it was manufactured in a different facility. Canada dodged the narcolepsy that Europe saw. Smallpox vaccine was stopped because the side effects, well, there's no smallpox anymore, but there's a potential for it in biological warfare. It was known to kill at least 1 in a million children. It probably killed more people than that. Now that it's still used in the military. 1 in 100 military service members in a study by the military's top immunologist had heart inflammation as a result of the smallpox vaccine. I know of cases that required a heart transplant and died from the smallpox vaccine. Canada's last measles death was in 2014. The U.S. had a death that was related on autopsy to measles in 2015 in an immunocompromised adult. The last child who died in the U.S. was 2003 from measles. In 2011 in Quebec, there was a measles epidemic. It turned out not only was more than 95% of the population vaccinated, but that more than 50% of the children and people who developed measles had received 2 measles vaccines previously. After the Disneyland epidemic, it was found that 73 of the reported measles cases were sick due to a vaccine strain. They either caught it from their own vaccine or someone else's vaccine. That was published by Canadian and American researchers. Canada averages 1 death from whooping cough a year, the U.S. about 10. The vast majority of whooping cough cases are like bad colds and go undiagnosed. More than 80% of cases recently in California were in fully vaccinated children. I may just skip this, but there are no rubella cases, there are no polio cases. There are some varicella cases. The vaccine is about 85% effective initially. It wanes. The varicella vaccine is not used in the UK. Most immunocompromised children who develop varicella, and a lot of them do after an organ transplant, bone marrow transplant, the expectation is that they are likely to get it. They are treated prophylactically with antiviral drugs. They survive. 1 child death per year from varicella in the United States. So, in Canada, you have about 10 children dying from influenza each year, none for measles, mumps, rubella, diphtheria, tetanus, and 1 from whooping cough. So we're talking here about 11 deaths in children in Canada per year from potentially preventable infectious diseases. The problem, though, is even if you vaccinated everybody, it would only make a very small difference because the influenza vaccine is less than 50% effective, and the pertussis vaccine wanes, rapidly falls off. So the first year, one study said 67% effectiveness for pertussis, and by year 4, 9%. That was in a Kaiser study published in the Journal of Pediatrics. Should we be concerned about vaccine quality? Vaccines are biologics, and according to FDA, quote, most biologics are complex mixtures that are not easily identified or characterized, unquote. Translation, vaccines contain unknown substances. This makes them challenging to monitor. When manufacturers are discovered by FDA to be hiding problems, they are fined. No executives are jailed. Over 80% of the drugs sold in the United States are manufactured overseas, mainly in India and China. As best I am able to tell, our vaccines are not made outside North America and Europe yet. Large multinational pharmaceutical companies, such as Sanofi, Sanofi has vaccine manufacturing facilities in both India and China. India and China each have more than 20 vaccine companies, and it is probably only a matter of time before vaccines manufactured in countries known for inadequate monitoring are being sold in Canada and the U.S. And The Lancet discussed a scandal in China last year. I quote, Chinese vaccine manufacturer Changsheng Biotechnology was found to have fabricated production and inspection records for rabies vaccines. Furthermore, substandard DPT vaccines were administered to 215,000 children, and 400,000 substandard DPT vaccines were sold, unquote. Now I'm going to get into a specific Canadian example. Influenza is a big problem. Fortunately, it's not a terrible problem in children, although 10 die a year in Canada and about 120 die a year in the U.S. But many thousands of people get influenza. The problem is the vaccines don't work very well, and so there are many different kinds of manufacturing processes now used to make flu vaccines. We have about 12 different flu vaccines licensed in the U.S. 90% of flu deaths occur in those over 65. So even though 2/3 of Americans over 65 get flu vaccine, many of them do not develop immunity. And every year, flu vaccines are designed newly from the strains predicted for the next season. Because of this, clinical tests for safety are not required before they're used. Yearly flu vaccines are grandfathered in, but they are checked for manufacturing defects. When a pandemic flu vaccine caused 1,300 cases of narcolepsy in Europe in 2009, the European Medicines Agency, equivalent to the FDA, failed to warn the public of this in a timely manner, leading to extended use of the problematic vaccine. This episode provides a warning that regulators' first priority may not always be the public's welfare. Anyway, to help those over 65, 2 strategies are used to enhance immunity from vaccines. The second involves the use of novel adjuvants, which are substances that provide increased stimulation to the immune system. Potentially, this can improve immunity, but it might increase inflammation and autoimmune diseases. The Fluad vaccine is the only influenza vaccine in Canada and the U.S. to contain a novel immune-boosting adjuvant. Fluad was licensed for those over 65 in Canada in 2011. The Government of Ontario's fact sheet on the vaccine made clear that by 5 years later, it was still not known whether the excess immune stimulation it provides actually improved protection against the flu. Fluad causes about 15% more local reactions than vaccines lacking the adjuvant, but we don't know if it causes more serious adverse reactions. Canada and the U.S. recommend yearly flu vaccines for all eligible children over 6 months, while most of Europe does not. Very young children generate a poor immune response to current flu vaccines, while few die from the illness. 8 of the 10 Canadian children who died last year were aged between 2 and 4. Canada's National Advisory Committee on Immunization reviewed the literature on the use of Fluad in infants and young children in 2015. They wrote, quote, "The safety information is limited in children with immunodeficiencies and other chronic illnesses. There are insufficient data to assess whether adjuvanted flu vaccine is more effective than unadjuvanted or live attenuated flu vaccine in practice, or to make an informed risk-benefit analysis." The reviewers also noted that the European Medicines Agency failed to license the vaccine for European children in 2012. The EMA report found a number of problems with the single pivotal clinical trial of Fluad in children. The report concluded, quote, "The overall benefit-risk balance of Fluad pediatric is negative," unquote. Despite the lack of evidence of benefit, limited and unreliable safety information, rejection in Europe, and no other developed country using it for children, let alone infants, in 2015, the Public Health Agency of Canada licensed Fluad Pediatric for use in infants and babies aged 6 months to 2 years. It seems that Canada's youngest children have been selected to serve as the guinea pigs, without their parents' knowledge, in a massive immune stimulation experiment of this novel adjuvanted vaccine.
We remind you that we are at 20 minutes, and if you would like to save time for questions.
Two sentences.
Perfect. It is your right
you.
if you wish to speak for full 30 minutes and not entertain questions.
Public health officials encourage, exhort, and cajole vaccinations. Their conduct with the Fluad pediatric vaccine has shown they must not be given the power to compel. Thank you.
Apologize. If I'd realized you were that close, I would have let you. not bothered interjecting. Any questions? Mr. McKee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the previous presenter told us that his position was that he's not against vaccines, but against mandatory vaccines. It sounds like your position is you're against vaccines altogether. Is that correct?
No. I'm fully vaccinated, and my children are fully vaccinated. But I advised my children to slow down on some of my grandchildren's vaccinations and omit the hepatitis B, which is completely unnecessary when they are not exposed to it. So I wasn't choosy as a younger adult, but having had personal experience with hundreds of people whose lives have been ruined by anthrax vaccine, I started looking much more closely at vaccines.
So you are against the mandatory vaccines, but you claim that you are for some vaccines, but not all?
This is not I'm sorry, I must have omitted part of my testimony, which said that apologize. Vaccination is not a one-size-fits-all procedure. According to the Mayo Clinic, human antibody response to measles vaccine is highly variable in the population. Females have more adverse reactions than males. Gender and race influence the response, as does heredity. Basically, I think that vaccines are drugs, and why you go to a doctor instead of getting a prescription from a computer is that the doctor's job is to manage your risks and benefits, as well as public health officials whose job is to manage population risks and benefits. So I am in favor. I think as many vaccines should be licensed as can be developed, as long as the benefit is greater than the risk. And unfortunately, it's hard to generate adequate evidence for vaccines, especially in light of the fact that most of these diseases don't occur. For example, we have anthrax vaccine. We don't have anthrax, so we don't know how well it protects. We can measure antibodies, but in fact, in animal studies, the level of antibodies doesn't reflect whether the animal is going to be protected or not. So I'm in favor of data. I wrote the first review article on anthrax vaccine. I published a lot of papers. I consider myself a scientist. The data on vaccines is not what you would want.
Thank you, Mr. McKee, for your question.
I just have...
If there is time, we will circle back. Any questions?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for being here. I'm going to talk a little bit about your state. You're born and raised in the state of Maine?
No, born in New York, raised in New Jersey.
Okay. How long have you been in Maine?
22 years.
22 years. So what has been your experience with the measles outbreak in the state of Maine?
We had the first case in 20 years in 2017, and that person did not affect anyone else. In fact, it was a Canadian who was visiting.
So that's the only case that has been in.
I think there was one last year that was turned out to be a vaccine strain. As far as I know, that's all.
So what would you attribute that to?
What would I attribute what to?
To only one case.
Well, the measles vaccine has, very good protection. The initial protection is over 90%, and it wanes slowly. The best vaccine in terms of efficacy is the measles vaccine.
So you're saying that your children have gotten the vaccine, and do you have grandchildren too?
Yes.
And your advice to the mother and father were?
One's a doctor and one's a nurse practitioner, so I don't know they took my advice, but
they always listen to the
my
grandmother.
Advice was to give them the MMR later. There is data that giving it later, after 15 months or later, you get a higher efficacy, higher chance that it will take, and probably less side effects. So I told them, do not give it at 12 months, give it later. And I think they did. They probably gave it at 15 or 18 months.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. That's all I have.
Thank you. Ms. Minton?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here today. I have two quick questions. One, I'm wondering if you could just clarify a bit. You said your expenses were paid. I was wondering if you could clarify by whom.
By whom? I haven't been paid yet, so it's come out of my pocket. Okay. I'm under the impression that Vaccine Choice Canada will pay my expenses.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. The other question I had, you were just referencing that there's different responses among different populations, and I was wondering how that could be better addressed. I guess if this is true, I guess I need to look at for references or whatever. But
the Mayo Clinic group,
how that could be
which is led by Greg Poland, is the group that's been writing about this the most lately, and they're talking about trying to develop personalized vaccinology, so that if you could look at a person's HLA status or other genetic status, know something about their family history, you could choose so everyone doesn't need the same dose. If women get higher antibody responses and higher adverse reactions than men when they get vaccinated, maybe women need a smaller dose. But right now we get the same dose. I was very surprised to find that babies who get the DPT at 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, 18 months, and 5 years get a higher dose than the single adult DPT dose. Is that necessary? Is that a cause of more adverse reactions? So, that people are only just now starting to look at this one-size-fits-all question. But parents who choose not to vaccinate are often doing so because another member of the family had some kind of reaction. And they are probably a higher risk group. Again, if you mandate and if they are all vaccinated, you may gain a tiny bit. As I said, you might prevent a few measles cases and nobody will die, but you will have a higher rate of vaccine adverse reactions in that population.
Okay, thank you. I think that's probably my time.
Thank you. Mr. DeSonia?
Questions. Thanks for being here. I'd really like to know what brings you to Canada. Did you just come here on your own, or did somebody invite you? Or
Stephanie, the same lady who invited Dr. Sears, invited me.
She's a busy gal, isn't she? I have nothing further. Thank you.
We do have a few extra minutes. Mr. McKee, would you like to continue?
Well, I guess, the question would have been on who invited and who's paying the expenses. Just from some of your answers, so I got the answers to those questions, but some of your answers that you gave to other questions talked about giving vaccines later on in a child's life. So if the schedule was different, would you be more in favor of mandating these vaccines? Is it because of a 12-month-old baby cannot handle what they're being given that you oppose it?
That's a good question. There's not enough science to answer it. But the part of the question is, am I in favor of the vaccine schedule? Well, nobody's studied the vaccine schedule. So people think that all these vaccines have been studied together to see whether they all work okay together, whether one should be omitted or the timing changed, but that has not occurred. Actually, the timing is based on when children ordinarily go to the pediatrician. So there's a group in the United States, there's a group of vaccine experts who advise the CDC what vaccines should be added to the schedule, and usually most of them have consulted for vaccine companies. Usually they're particularly in favor of vaccines, and so many vaccines get added to the schedule or licensed without being added to the schedule. But if they are added to the schedule in the U.S., they have full liability, almost full liability protection. So the interest is in adding more to the schedule. And the 2016 21st Century Cures Act actually mandates that any time a vaccine is licensed, CDC and its advisory committee must, at its next meeting, consider that vaccine for addition to the childhood schedule. Also, what that bill did in the U.S. was to take any vaccine that is recommended by that group for pregnant women, take the liability away. And how we do that in the U.S. is 75 cents per dose of vaccine goes into a fund, and then you litigate against the Department of Health and Human Services through the vaccine injury program to try to get paid if you believe you've had a vaccine injury. And that program was instituted in, I think, 1987 and has paid out about $4 billion.
Thank you. With 2 minutes remaining, Madame Landry.
Thank you, Madame la Présidente. A quick question. On the first page of your testimony, the New York Times, and I cite, said that it costed $2,200 to fully vaccinate one child. Have you, or is there any evidence or data that is available that would say to a government how much it would cost the healthcare system not to if they were not vaccinated?
Well, I mean, I don't think we're talking about not vaccinating every child. I think we want all the parents who, I mean, vaccines are a good thing for society and for the vast majority of individuals. So people have done studies on, well, if no one was vaccinated for such and such disease, we'd have so many cases and the economic cost would be less than so. But since that's not how it works, you know, people choose. And in Canada, your vaccines are almost free. In the U.S., they are too. Actually, again, the Affordable Care Act said that vaccines should not require a copay. And so, you know, apart from lack of access to a medical facility, 95% of children in Maine, on average, are vaccinated for all the main required vaccines. They are not getting every other vaccine, which is how I think it should be. About 75% get the hepatitis B vaccine, which is unnecessary for over 90% of them. The Gardasil vaccine, you know, children are going to spread HPV through sexual activity. Why vaccinate them at age 11? You know, I think parents are smart to avoid certain vaccines. But thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and we appreciate you being here today.